his work on labor has had an enormous influence on people who are not economists, particularly on sociologists like myself. He's one of the few economists we can actually understand, which is a nice thing to do. But he's also expanded the territory of how we think about social relations in a way that has brought economics and sociology together. So this is, for me, a very precious occasion. I'm going to talk to you today about work. I'm not going to read my paper, but I'm going to speak from it more informally. It's something that tends to drop out in discussions of capitalism for obvious reasons. We focus on where the money comes from on the finance side, and rather neglect the side of labor. And that's a particular problem when we think about the ethical issues, because people are today, both men and women, spending most of their conscious hours in activities related to work. And the quality of that conscious engagement matters. Now, I'm not exactly going to be talking to you about ethics, which is not a subject I have any mastery of, and but I am going to be talking to you about something that's allied to it, which is the quality of work experience. And just to give a large framework for what I think is happening to work quality in the modern world, I want to talk, just to set the stage for this, I want to talk about time and organizational structure. What I want to say to you about, from the studies of work that I do, which are studies mostly of large organization with employees, more than 5,000 employees, big companies, is that in the last generation, there has been a profound change in the experience of time from linear time to serial time. And maybe I can make that clear to you, what that means. If you think about the Old English meaning of the word job and career, in Chaucer's day, a job was a lump of coal, a bundle of wood, anything that could be moved around indiscriminately. Whereas a career meant a straight-laid path. And I think that Old English usage is a guide to the way in which jobs are replacing careers in the modern work world. That is to say that we're getting serial experiences of time that are quite flexible, rather than things that are laid out in a more narrative fashion. In the real world of work, this change is linked to not simply to the shrinking length in which people hold full-time jobs, but the enormous growth of part-time work, which is almost exponentially risen in the last 30 years, and to the increasing amounts of time that, and to the increases in changes of employers. Just to give you one statistic, the modal worker in 1960 would, in his, and it's a his, lifetime work for 3 or 4 employers. The modal worker who's 25 to 35 today will work for 11 or 12. So the notion of making a career within a company, that old notion of work life, has profoundly changed. What I study about this in particular is the effect on this of skill development. Because one of the things we're finding about this change from linear to serial time is that we're having a lot of skill wastage and de-skilling which occurs in this process. People are not building on their former skills as they progress through their job course. They get turned to the side, they lose things they knew how to do before, or given the conditions of the labor market today, they're actually de-skilled in the course of these shifts. And that's a sociological and policy problem that I'm very much concerned with. I want to focus today on what it means to think of yourself as having a career which is modeled on that of a consultant rather than an employee. And as somebody who moves from task to task, there's very little low commitment to any particular organization, jets in, jets out. What kind of shape to work does that give? What kind of narrative is a consultant's narrative of meaningful work? To talk about that, obviously we have to talk about institutions. And here, the large story, again in the last 30 or 40 years, is the huge change in corporate organization, which has tended to flexibilization and fragmentation. It's intimately connected with the short-term experience of work. And there's a very practical reason why corporations are increasingly resemble Hewlett-Packard. I don't know if any of you are following its fortunes. It can't decide what it does. And every time it gets a new CEO, it has a new business plan. And it's desperately seeking to find a rationale to do the things it does. There is a reason for this, and it's a very compelling one, in my view. The reason is this, that after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods agreements, that corporations began investment vehicles became open to global investment. Global investment tended to focus more and more on short-term market advantage, on share price rather than long-term profit. And as a result, in the social organization of corporations, they were forced to become more and more adapted to short-term swerves in the market to get market share and so reach their price. Insecurity became economic in this transformation. That is, if you destabilized a corporation, the simple fact of re-engineering, which is often very traumatic for corporations, sent a signal to markets which was positive. And I've done a lot of work on that correlation, that companies that are in flux are more attractive than companies which are stable to globalized investors. So the corporation becomes something like a chameleon, flexible. What we know about this in terms of the inner life of how employees work in this short-term, chameleon-like work world is exemplified by what's sometimes called the silo effect. That is to say that this is a situation which produces sociologically more and more isolation and fragmentation. That serial time combined with this kind of market responsiveness produces a kind of isolation. What that means is the following. In a condition where you belong to an institution for a short period of time with a constantly changing cast of workers, and this is where we get to the individualism issue, the notion of one's capital, one's social capital in that situation, tends to be something that focuses on hoarding what you have rather than sharing it with other people. That is, you're looking for a niche by looking for something that only you can do. And the result of that, as we know from innumerable studies, is that this silo mentality grows up where people who are dealing with conditions of fragmentation and serial time by essentially putting their heads down and trying to control as much the information flows that come out of them, cooperation with others, their interaction with peers, and so on, as a defense mechanism. Often when I read management literature, this is described as an individualized failure, that the silo effect is something that has to do with the personal qualities of employees. And my argument has been that that isolation is structurally built in to the conditions of insecurity and short-term time. This is a systems effect rather than an individual failing. So that's the broad background, issues about changes in time and the sociology of isolation are the broad background to the paper that I've presented to you. Now, you ought to be suspicious as economists of this paper only because I'm an ethnographer and we deal in small n's, small numbers of people. If you interview people for an hour and a half or 2 hours individually, you produce, if you interview 150 people, something like half of à la recherche du temps perdu. It's a rather hard amount of material to deal with. So we get depth, but not breadth. And the way in which we try and deal with that is by well-focused studies that make clear contrasts among samples of small numbers of people. The paper that I've given to you is such an example of that. It explores a contrast both in time and structure. I've presented to you the contrast between a highly formalized experience of labor among factory workers in the 1970s who lived in that linear time compared to the much more deregulated experience of work among back office workers on Wall Street who are people who have they're white collar, they have technical skills. They couldn't be more different, both in their class structure and in their institutional, in their education and in the institutional setting from each other. And this is not exactly a compare and contrast. What I'm trying to present by this contrast is to say that these old formal structures, the paradox was that this formality enabled a certain kind of informal sociability. That is to say that highly rigid structures enabled a kind of informal sociability both between peers and between bosses and employees. Whereas isolating, fragmented, short-term work, highly educated work, is in search of formal structure for its meaning. And that's the situation, that's what my back office employees on Wall Street were in search of, what they felt they were lacking. That is, the formal conditions that would allow them to practice sociability. So it's a real paradox that informal structure produces a need for formal sociability, and highly overdetermined formal structure enables informality. And that's the point of this research. what do I mean by sociability in this? In my view, this is just the way I work as a sociologist. I divide sociability into three distinct elements: cooperation, trust, and experiences of authority. These are interlocked in sociability. I've used the example of, I've used the image of a social triangle here. I've already been told I should have used the image of a triptych, which is a much better, these are three scenes that are locked together, that the geometry is all wrong. Since I can barely add 2 and 2, I have to accept that this is geometrically false. In the people that I and my team have been interviewing on Wall Street, oh, and I should say one other thing about this. These are all people who suffered periods of unemployment after the big bust of autumn 2008. And one of the things that we know about, for white-collar workers, about unemployment is that rather than just seen as a sudden absence of work, these are, after all, people who many of them had financial resources to weather the storms slowly. It becomes kind of rite of passage. So most of the people that we interviewed were thinking about how, not getting their old jobs back, but how they could work differently. And this is a very common thing for middle class employees who have some long-term prospects of getting work. That what they're focused on is a kind of reflection on how they were working before and how they want to work instead differently. At the extreme, of the 86 people we've so far interviewed, I think 11 of them have dreamt of starting an organic farm somewhere in New England, a sure side to ruin. Many more of them have left the finance sector and gone into nonprofits because they have the money to do this. Most of them have tried to start small firms and get away from large-scale businesses like Lehman or Chase that they were in before. So, unlike for working class people where the loss of a job is pure economic trauma, for the kinds of people I and my team have been interviewing, there's been a real reflection on the meaning of the work that they've been doing. And I'm going to tell you something about and make some contrast to these manual workers about each of these three areas of cooperation, trust, and authority. The first has to do with cooperation. Every business school, of course, tries to teach young middle-class workers to exhort them to be cooperative, and even tries to teach them techniques of cooperation, like how to shake hands with somebody else in a meeting, meeting etiquette, and so on. In this study, as in other studies that my long-suffering team has done, we found that people find this largely to be a sham, that the codes of teamwork are what the analyst Gideon Kunda, my former student, calls feigned solidarity, that cooperation becomes more of a question of presentation of self than actual risk-taking working with others. Again, we don't want to look at this as a psychological flaw. It's structured into the way in which teams are composed in high finance organizations or high-tech organizations. The logic for composing a team, for teamwork, is to keep their period of interaction short. 8 months is considered the maximum. The fear is that the team will otherwise become ingrown. Oh God, I've got to hurry up. that means that people will develop real social bonds to each other, and that those will override doing what management wants. It contrasts to the kind of teamwork that you see in a factory that we saw in the factories in the 1970s, in which people will, for instance, cover at work, lie to the boss for the sake of an employee who's hungover, drunk, or having marital troubles or something like that, which is a kind of cooperation which is earned by long-term association. Whereas for the people that we've been interviewing, for these middle-class people, cooperation is a kind of more dramatic display of self, of egotism, if you like. That's the paradox of it, that you display your individual kind of egoistic capacity by appearing cooperative always to a boss. Similarly, for distrust, it was very striking to us that how few of these middle-class back office employees had trust either in peers, for reasons you can understand, sort of stab in the back office politics, but even more, they had very low levels of trust in the corporations to which they worked. And I'm not going to explain that to you. If you read the paper, you'll understand how that is. That is, the default position is that the corporation will screw you. And very surprisingly to me, as opposed to the glass factory that I studied in Boston in the 1970s, where there was a horrible record of labor management conflict, the notion that the actual bosses themselves were good guys was much higher. And that seeming paradox is because they knew these people. They'd worked with them. They'd fought them for a long time. They'd arrived at labor agreements with them. So that the notion that you're going to be betrayed is separated in the old system. This is where the informality comes from the bosses themselves, whereas for the people we interviewed, this was quite different. And that comes to the third level of this triptych, as I guess I have to think of it, which has to do with questions of authority. And I would say that this is, I would say, the most grave problem that the kinds of corporations we were studying, large, global, short-term, fragmented corporations face, which is a crisis of authority. It's embodied in a way in the contrast between Jamie Dimon and Richard Fuld. For the people we interviewed, Dimon is seen to be somebody who, during an economic crisis, defended his organization. And Fuld, as you know, the head of the collapsed Lehman, somebody who threw the back office employees to the wolves. And the idea that people had, I mean, Dimon, there are many bad things you could say about him, but in the perhaps, but in the minds of his employees, he was somebody who showed himself loyal to people who were loyal to him. But the modal position for most of these employees, as in other studies we've done, is that the old analogy that Max Weber made between military authority and corporate authority no longer holds. That when confronted with a crisis, the capitalist general will desert his troops. That's an overwhelming fear that these people have, embodied between these two figures. There was, secondly, and this has to do with the class structure. 0 minutes, okay. There is an inverse, there's a problem of legitimacy in that many of these back office employees think of themselves as more competent than their bosses. And this is something that these are technicians who were appalled that their bosses, particularly in the financial industry, weren't interested in understanding algorithms that were producing the wealth for the people at the top. They took it for granted. The people in the back office who understood and wrote these algorithms felt that the indifference of the bosses to actually understanding what was making them rich made them illegitimate. And the third issue that arises here is a question of procedural justice. Because of this time lag that I've described to you, people at the top tend to go in and out of corporations much more rapidly than people in the middle. And it produces a situation in which employees are often being, there's a kind of deus absconditus problem, where their bosses, who know how they work, are leaving. That they're not judged by people who really know them because of this differential movement. And the result of that has been more and more dependence on HR departments, which are at a great distance from these people who don't know them personally and using very impersonal standards. So, to sum up about this, there is, as a qualitative crisis in work today among middle-class people, a problem about false forms of cooperation, which are really theatrical displays of sociability. There is a problem about trust and trustableness of other employees, which is linked to a problem about hierarchy. And that problem could be simply put that in the modern workplace, legitimacy and power have been disconnected. Now, in my view, these are all defects that have to be remedied, if at all, by rethinking what corporations are in terms of the social relations of people at work, rather than thinking about the bottom line. If you're interested in ethics, and these are ethical problems of everyday life for the people that I interview. If you're interested in ethics, you have to start with reconceiving, rebuilding a social order in the corporation, independent of thinking about whether it's going to be attractive to the market or not. And that's what this is not pie in the sky. This is what finally the penny is dropped for corporations like General Motors or Hewlett-Packard, that they can't become sustainable organizations unless this kind of social reimagination occurs. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over.
Before I begin, what's the old joke? You have to say a few words before you begin. The few words are to help you check the mic. And I always use the joke, which I learned from Grayson Kirk, a former president of this university, which was, I suppose, not a good joke, but usable. I have to begin to speak and you to listen. If you finish before I do, please raise your hand. And I always use that to see if there are no hands not hearing me as I begin. Second point on time, that I'm allowed 25 minutes. I have a talk that's much longer than that. I have tried to abridge it, to do the first part in about 12 minutes, and each of the examples in 6 or 7 minutes each. That means that when I finish the second example, if I'm running long, I can abridge and come within the limits. Now, with palpitations of the heart and genuflections of the knees, to quote an inaugural lecture in medieval poetry that I heard many years ago from a distinguished lecturer, a distinguished professor, I approach this topic of moving from the conceptual relations of philosophy, which are clear lines, analytically drawn, to the gnarled thickets of economics in the woes of empirical argument. This difference, this distance, between the concept and the percept is the refrain that runs throughout this talk. Kant referred to it, to anticipate my conclusion, by saying that concepts without percepts are empty. But I argue that concepts are never completely without percepts and never completely empty. They provide sketches. Pardon me. And Kant added that percepts without concepts are blind. But the empiricists always have some conceptual presuppositions in mind. It's never quite, as the cliche goes, blind empiricism. And therefore, the distance between these two has to be bridged, and somehow it's bridged, in my view, by, as I will say again before I conclude a couple times probably, bringing to bear the values you hold, which include attitudinal components, or the values that are held by the decision makers, and the best empirical judgments you can make as reasons for making decisions on these issues. Now, my trepidations are increased when I recall a very imperial, authoritative lecture, both academically and in style, that I heard from Professor Charles Isawi, who was then a professor of economics at this university, at the Seminar in General Education, who said that all curricula are divided into three parts: the works of God, the works of man, and the works of the devil. He then proceeded to explain that the natural sciences, physics with the sublimities of nature and the astronomy with the sublimities of the stars and the heavens, and chemistry with the objects of the materials of the earth and the heavens, and biology with the stuff of life were the works of God. And of course, the great works of art and literature, from Homer and through Shakespeare, Keats, or Mary Ann Evans, to get in a woman, otherwise known as George Eliot, the works of men and women are the works of mankind. And then he added, with self-deprecation, as a professor of economics of the history of the Middle East, that economics and politics were the works of the devil, since they involved, as everyone knows, Machiavellian cynicism about human nature and oscillation between fear and greed, and so on. This latter description of the dismal science has become trite. It's saved from triteness in my approach when I consider another colloquium which was given at Columbia by Professor Leszek Kolakowski on an essay called Politics and the Devil. It's interesting that Professor Rapaczynski, who is a discussant for these talks, was present at that lecture of Professor Kolakowski. Not only that, he even was sitting next to dinner with Professor Kolakowski that night, and he suggested to me that it is possible that there's an element of mythical exaggeration, or the exaggeration of myth, in the stories that Professor Kolakowski was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and was subject to prison and torture. What is true without controversy is that he was a zealous and ardent supporter of Marxism in his youth and became deeply disillusioned and critical, subsequently gaining exile from Poland to move first to liberation in All Souls College, which I guess is a form of liberation, and then to a hotbed of non-Marxist economics, the University of Chicago. The relevant point here is Professor Kolakowski's thesis about the nature of the devil. His argument was that the devil did not exploit man's tendency to sin, or what the Bible calls the desire of his heart to do evil in Genesis, but that the devil exploited the very opposite: our desires for good, our ambitions for justice, and for a world of universal righteousness, and so on. And his illustrations in the history of Christendom were the effort to achieve a medieval theocracy in the medieval period, and Marxism in the 19th and 20th century. His point was that singly, there was nothing wrong with any of the values of Marxism that you sing, for example, in the International, to avoid being prisoners of starvation or the wretched of the earth, to achieve justice, to achieve equality, to realize progress, to eliminate poverty. But that put together, these represented the devil's seductive illusion that laid the basis for coercive utopianism that led to evil. And that this was the diabolical work in morality of the devil. This thesis of Kolakowski was argued in a very independent way by Isaiah Berlin in an essay on the nature of the ideal, or actually the search for the ideal. And in this lecture, Berlin criticized not Marxism, he had a tendency to, which was called by Philip Rieff the Berlin syndrome, to withdraw from confrontation, but to go back to the source, namely Platonic monism, and to argue that Platonic monism represented this basis for coercive utopianism. In Berlin's argument, any group of ideals tied together in a coherent and way which would allow a hierarchy and a ranking, and which would argue for completeness, was bound to represent a fallacious activity. It represented a denial of pluralism that was inevitable for the good society. So even if we take Plato's quartet, wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, almost a platitudinous set of virtues, first, they are incomplete. Where is consent of the governed? Where is freedom? Where is democracy placed in a tertiary rank? And secondly, of course, they would not work as a coherent set. You can just say wisdom is the heart of the philosopher king, courage the heart of the military rulers. There's no mechanism for negotiation of disagreement among them in the Republic. You'd certainly have to decide how the philosophers will reign in the military, or sometimes how the military judgment will be used and applied when there's a clear and present danger. Yet the simple assertion of the utopian ideals in a monistic framework fails. And Berlin, in that sense, is giving a kind of what I call analogously to Gödel theorem on incompleteness of monistic ideals, just as Gödel argued that any theorem which would complete mathematics and tell you whether any statement of the language, or any well-formed statement of the language, is or is not a theorem in the language, that such a completeness theorem would generate a contradiction in the language. Berlin argues that any monistic interpretation of ethics would fail to be ethical. In that sense, pluralism is a necessity of the ethical life. You must have plural values, and there has to be incompleteness, conflict, compromise among them in order to have a good society. You cannot have a utopian blueprint for a society. Berlin's pluralism, and it was a pluralism without relativism, I should mention to support Professor Maffettone's objectivity, Berlin's pluralism without relativism was supported by the philosopher with whom he team-taught, John Austin, who argued, in language that I suppose politically incorrect, that with all value terms, it was the correlative opposite term that, in Austin's phrase, that's the political incorrectness, wore the trousers. So if you looked at freedom, it's an ambiguous term, and you have to look at the correlative opposite to know what you mean by the term. So freedom against slavery means one thing, different thing from freedom against order. Case, of course, of freedom against slavery, you do not want a balance between freedom and slavery. You want the abolition of slavery and the establishment of freedom. Case of freedom and order, you do not want or freedom and security. You do not want the abolition of security and disorder. You want a balance between freedom and order. And you go on, freedom in the case of goods like pure air, pure water, what's the price? And how high is the price to be paid for pure water, pure air? In the case of freedom from an addiction, you have a different use of the language, the seat being occupied as opposed to free. And of course, Henry James in Washington Square tells us that the young suitor of the father's daughter, at least in the father's view, acted freely, and that is a pejorative term, as opposed to acting with restraint or with self-restraint. So you have that concepts have to be plural, are ambiguous, are incomplete or incoherent, and therefore it is a perpetual striving to achieve a balance among values in a society. And there can be no blueprint or monistic set of values. Now this is a lesson which has been difficult to learn against attempts at social planning or coherent social planning, against attempts at what Popper, following Berlin, called social engineering. And there are all sorts of issues that are raised by this kind of distinction. I am not trying here, indeed it's the exact opposite, to dissolve these issues. I'm trying to suggest only throughout that if we have plural values, then how do we decide among these values? We cannot decide on the basis of philosophical foundations or philosopher kings. We decide on the basis of value decisions that are made at a particular moment and that make reference to the best empirical knowledge we have as reasons for making these decisions. The formula which I use in terms of the justification of these decisions in bridging philosophical conceptual analysis to economic empiricism. Now there are two examples only that I've chosen, and they're quite different, and indeed the discussion yesterday provided perhaps more richer and more, what you would say, interesting examples than the ones I've chosen, particularly since the first one is historical. But the first example is an interesting one in the history of economics and of politics, and it's undecided. It's the question of a relationship between political freedom, or individual freedom, to use again Professor Maffettone's phrase perhaps, individual freedoms, consent of the governed, which is part of the notion of freedom, and free markets and growth, economic growth that presumably follows from free markets, the relationship between political variables and the economic variables. It is true that the background of modern economics was a change in the general evaluation of freedom. As was pointed out yesterday, freedom of Protestantism, the decision that one's choice of faith was somehow free, not perhaps a leap of faith, but nonetheless something that the free individual made, that it was a free individual choice, had something to do with the spread of the notion of social freedom in a society. Certainly rationality in the sense of the belief that the light of reason determined decisions, not so duty to divine law or natural law, but the light of individual reason, which was to decide questions at issue based on the evidence and as it appeared to the individual person. This argument of Descartes on the one hand, of Luther in the former case, suggested a great role for individual freedom. If we use the economic illustration, the notion of a just price, which is the price which is seen by a rational mind who observes the laws of nature as these reflect divine law, and discovers the just price for a person's labor or for a product, becomes replaced by the notion of the price that individual buyers and individual sellers arrive at through each asserting their interests, and in a free market, the just price is the optimal. There is no just price. The optimal price that emerges based on these individual interest and individual consent in a market operation. That replacement. So we go from notions of freedom in the political domain to notions of freedom in the economic domain. And in the Scottish Enlightenment, as was mentioned also in tracing the argument yesterday, Adam Smith represents a high point in the demonstration of how the invisible hand works in the marketplace, even though he also admits, of course, the visible hand, that is to say, the public sector, and, of course, the eleemosynary traditions of the not-for-profit sector, so that his values are not only the economic values that emerge in a free market, or the values of the individuals that emerge in a free market, but also the defense and public education that are responsibilities of the public sector, and, of course, what we would now call the equivalent of safety net that emerges in the church and in the not-for-profit sector of a society. The question that emerges clearly is there a connection? Is there a necessary connection between political freedom, or the freedom of the political variables, and economic freedom? I recall that Sidney Hook first reviewed Hayek's Road to Serfdom reviewed Hayek's Road for Serfdom when it was first published in the United States in the New York Times Book Review. And Hook had only recently emancipated himself from Marxist determinism. And the question he raised in that review was, is Hayek providing an inverse form of determinism? That if the market is free, then there will be political freedom. And if we do not have a free market, then we cannot achieve political freedom. And is sometimes argued that the Austrian school has done this even to quantitative measure, that the degree to which economic transactions, the proportion to which economic transactions go through government is an index of whether you will have a free society or not have a free society. Actually, if you read Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, the most he will say is that rule of law is a necessary condition for free markets. The symbiosis between politics and economics is that rule of law is required, so that you could not have, in his view, economic growth under Stalin or a Mao or other persons who violate rule of law. But whether societies which have rule of law, even though they have degrees of socialism, would be allowed to have economic growth without free markets is, I think, debatable under Hayek's formulation. And what I've tried to do in the paper is suggest some cases where you have political authoritarianism and free markets, even picking some piquant cases like the issue of Pinochet and bringing in University of Chicago economics into Chile, or I take Stolyupin trying privatization in Russia, which led to his own assassination on the ground that he was trying political reform. But the overall question of a necessary connection between the political and economic variables remains open. Perhaps the highest point in suggesting that there is a necessary connection took place in the 1990s, when I think it's fair to say there was a general expectation, because of the changes in the Soviet Union and Communist China, that this was true. When the head of the KGB, Andropov, decided, or apparently decided, that the only way you could change Russia from being a first world military tied to a third world economy was by allowing Gorbachev to introduce greater degrees of individual freedom and public consent, including immigration for some and so on. This represented a commitment to the view that you had to have political change in order to get economic growth and indeed liberalization of markets. And when Communist China, even remaining one-party rule, decided it would introduce some degree of transparency, foreign investment, openings to the West, etc., clearly it meant that it accepted in part a connection between the political variables and the economic variables. So much so that Francis Fukuyama wrote, it's the end of history, that liberal democracy had shown itself to be the last great idea of history, using Hegel's idea of the end of history in 1806 to now be true with this capitulation of the socialist world to the idea of free markets and political freedom. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way with the reversions that took place, although it worked out that way for most European countries and still remains true in that way. N.G. Bramer wrote a response, perhaps intended to the end of the history, the end of the free market, after the financial crisis of 2008, in which he said that this has disproven this connection, that the evidence of Chinese growth has given to everyone everywhere, or to a lot of people everywhere, the belief that control of the market, as done by the Chinese Communist Party, is a better solution than, let's call it, the American model. And this remains now contested with many countries, obviously, Venezuela, Cuba, others, saying, isn't the Chinese model the optimal model, as opposed to any Hayekian interpretation of connection between political freedom and economic freedom. The issue remains open, and even a person like Professor Ferguson, who projects completely and certainly the triumph, the Chinese success in overcoming America's GDP by 2025, does not exclude the possibility along the way it will require democratic reforms or other kinds of reforms in order to achieve that kind of growth. Indeed, Fukuyama insists that it will not achieve that growth unless these kinds of political reforms also take place. So this question remains open, and my formula recurs. We have to see what will happen on the basis of, and what we decide on the basis of values, conceptual alternatives decided, plural values and conceptual alternatives decided by empirical considerations that provide reasons for our decisions. I think I have a little time to do my last example, which has to do with the relationship between equality, growth, reduction of poverty, and sustainability of growth. First, I go through some illustrations that are in themselves very interesting of notions of equality that seem independent of growth and how growth would change them. You have, of course, the Spartan model of equality, which has been a perennial through monastic life, through kibbutzim, through Tolstoyan villages. And it's opposed in a way to growth because growth leads to corruption and inequality. You have the Rawlsian model of the difference principle, that inequalities are arbitrary except for the benefit of the most disadvantaged. And if you apply sufficient growth, that would allow a great deal of distance between the most rich and the most poor, as Ned Phelps mentioned yesterday. And you have Williams arguing the need must be the sole relevant reason as a definition of equality, and you obviously cannot sustain a healthcare system in which need would be the sole relevant reason unless you achieve great economic growth, because the alternative is the farcical outcome, which is a play by Jules Romain Knock, played by the inevitable Louis Jouvet, in which the doctor looks forward to the time when the gross income of the entire region will be equivalent to what is spent on health care, since, as he says proudly, what is more important to any person than his health? Okay. Now, when we take equality and growth generally, it seems to me clear that historically, growth, targeting growth, leads to greater reduction of poverty than targeting equality. Is that a generalization that can be sustained? It seems to be true if we compare Maoist China's targeting equality, perhaps not a fair assumption, to current China with its emphasis on high growth rates. And the same can be true for other countries that have gone after high growth rates after pursuing equality for a long time, including Israel. And, of course, probably the United States and the American dream, which depends upon that 100 years or so of 3% or more annual growth rate as allowing upward mobility, or the egalitarian society in the sense of a society of opportunity. On the other hand, last night, that was the clash. The last words that Professor Stiglitz mentioned were a very empirical model that you target equality because there's an absence of demand, there's no absence of investment capital, which would want you to go for cutting taxes on the upper bracket to increase investment capital, as would be natural in supply side economics, as I understand it. Instead, you must target equality against inequality so as to increase demand, and that would lead to growth and reduction of poverty. So here is a conflict and a counter instance, and the question of which is more important for reduction of poverty, growth or equality, leads to the same, targeting growth or targeting equality, leads to the same resolution in a kind of refrain, namely, consider your values, including the attitudinal component, consider the empirical situation as reasons for coming to a decision. Now, having made this emphasis on growth, I conclude with a few words about the opposite of growth, on which Austin would give us some fun. What words could we use? Shrinkage, recession, dormancy, hibernation. Well, stagnation, the invented economic word, I guess, stagflation. J.P. Morgan's word, fluctuation. And of course, the optimal word that's used in different contexts, sustainable growth. And the question is, can you have limits? Now, in a finitistic world, this was much easier. And Professor Phelps's favorite philosopher, Aristotle, is here the philosopher of growth in a finitistic world. You don't have to admonish an Aristotelian that trees do not grow to the sky, as stockbrokers always admonish people, at least during good times, not during the present time, because for Aristotle, every single tree has its proper end. Oaks or rhododendrons have their proper height and can realize their proper height, just as stones move from their void to their proper place. And as man, of course, moves from his dynamis, his potentialities, to his end as a human being, which is his excellence. There's no question here of arriving at infinity in a finitistic universe. When you come to modern economics, scant resources that can grow infinitely, then of course you have a different problem. What about limits? Especially on the question of knowledge. My colleague this morning just mentioned Peirce's view that critical inquiry is always without limit. No bar ever to critical inquiry. John Dewey argued this: knowledge is infinite and cannot be blocked. Of course, the Second World War suggested very severe moral cases, the use of human beings in experiments, making a cobalt bomb, as cases where morality has to interfere to set limits to inquiry, that the Peircean doctrine that inquiry must never be blocked, sin against the Holy Ghost to ever block the road of inquiry, is not completely true. But still, as Karl Popper argued, and which I wish to go to conclude, the prediction of what the future of knowledge will bring is never predictable. That is to say, a prediction is never determinate. It is not predictable what the future of knowledge will bring. This leads to three possibilities. First possibility is what Popper used it for in his criticism of Marxism. No great social engineering or great planning, since you do not know the predictable consequences of knowledge. Therefore, you can't know unanticipated consequences. You cannot do large-scale social engineering. And this goes to plans for large-scale sustainability over 50 years. You cannot plan that. You do not know future knowledge. Indeed, paradoxically, you could even make the argument on Popper's view that since you do not know the predictability of knowledge, the possibility that later knowledge will give you much more efficient ways of getting rid of carbon would suggest not acting drastically, ways which would hurt the poor by cutting back electrification of the dark continent and so on in the present. Of course, the third option is to recognize that the general thesis that knowledge is unpredictable does not mean you should not take advantage and exploit the knowledge that you do have about what causes unlimited growth and what is needed to achieve greater sustainability based on the knowledge we have of climate and so on. So this means, again, that we are faced with uncertain choices, and the formula I've suggested I use again for the final time, that we have conceptual possibilities outlined, that we cannot decide on their basis, that we must have the empirical input, which we use our values as reasons for making decisions. In that sense, there are not philosophical foundations. There are no philosopher kings, but there are no economic monarchs either. We're faced with a polyarchy in which plural values mean we are always involved in compromise and choice.